inching closer to developing a nuclear weapon, it is imperative that we and our partners are prepared for the consequences. The US does not want a war in the Middle East, but we also cannot afford to accept a nuclear-armed Iran. The United States must equip and empower our regional partners and allies to confront Iran, use our diplomatic and economic levers to put pressure on the Iranian regime, and, if necessary, develop and maintain the capabilities needed to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. We cannot allow the world's biggest state sponsor of terror, the Iranian dictatorship, to possess a nuclear weapon and blackmail the free world. Iran must be stopped. It is a great pleasure to welcome a very close friend of the Heritage Foundation, the Right Honourable Liz Truss, who will deliver keynote remarks this morning. Liz is the author of 10 Years to Save the West, Leading the Revolution Against Globalism, Socialism and the Liberal Establishment, an extremely sound book. We had the honour of hosting Liz for the US launch of her book back in April of this year. Liz Truss served as the 56th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and is a long-standing advocate for robust Anglo-American leadership on the world stage, limited government, low taxes and individual freedom, both at home in the UK and around the world. She served 3 different prime ministers in 6 different roles around the cabinet before her own tenure in 10 Downing Street, including Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Lord Chancellor, Secretary of State for Justice, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Secretary of State for International Trade, and Foreign Secretary. Liz Truss is a courageous and principled Thatcherite, a strong supporter of the US-UK special relationship, and a true freedom fighter. Please join me in welcoming Liz to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Niall, and it's great to be back here at the Heritage Foundation, which has done so much to lead the way on what American foreign policy should look like, but also what the future of the free world looks like in order to take on the threats that we face to the West. And we are just after Thanksgiving, and I want to give thanks to the American people for electing Donald Trump as their president. Because can you imagine what American foreign policy would look like after 4 more years of Democrat so-called leadership, and what the world would look like after 4 more years of those failed policies? And there's a lot of talk that you hear in the press about the Trump phenomenon not being popular in Europe. I want to assure you that's not true. There are many of us in the UK and Europe who understand perfectly that we need strong American leadership, that we need peace through strength, and that Donald Trump is the person that can deliver that. In fact, in an opinion poll conducted this weekend in the UK, Donald Trump is more popular than United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And I believe that over the next few years, as we see the Trump presidency and we see the Keir Starmership prime ministership continue, that things are only going to move in an even more extreme direction in terms of their relative popularity. We have to acknowledge that the last 4 years of American foreign policy has been nothing short of disastrous. President Biden ignored his allies and appeased his enemies, and he showed weakness on the world stage time after time. We saw that in the run-up to the war that Vladimir Putin perpetrated in Ukraine. We saw it with the saber rattling that President Xi emboldened towards Taiwan. And we've seen it most clearly with what has happened with Iran. If we look back 4 years, Iran was under huge economic pressure. The Trump policy was working. And I believe that if President Trump had stayed in power in 2020, we'd not have been in a position of Iran being on the verge of getting nuclear weapons, and we would not have seen the appalling atrocity that took place in Israel on October the 7th. Both of those things are a direct result of a failed strategy of American foreign policy. Biden took the maximum pressure sanctions off Iran, and he believed, against all evidence to the contrary, that the flawed JCPOA could be revived. Now let's think about this agreement. It was a flawed agreement in the first place. And who was it backed up by? None other than Russia and China. That was the makeup of the original JCPOA. What Biden wanted to have is a weakened version of the JCPOA, but he had no leverage under which to achieve it. And at the time I was serving as the United Kingdom Foreign Secretary, I was arguing that the West needed to get tougher on Iran, that we needed to put back sanctions, because otherwise there was no reason for Iran to change their behavior. Time and time again, the US administration did not or could not face that. They wouldn't face up to it. They carried on kicking the can down the road, allowing Iran to develop those capabilities. At the same time, they also allowed Iran to make money out of their oil and gas reserves. The sanctions that were widely flouted and widely worked around by the enemies of the West. So what we saw was a failure to take action on the developing nuclear program, but also the economic enablement of Iran, not just to be able to fund their own activities, but also to be able to fund their proxies, like Hamas and Hezbollah, organizations which have created huge damage. What also happened was the weakness shown, whether it was on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether it was failure to take action on Putin early enough, whether it was failure to take action on Iran, whether it was failure to take action on China, is that all of those adversaries, which we would describe as the axis of authoritarianism, began to work together with each other. So we're now facing a much greater problem in 2024 than we faced in 2020, because we have the Iranians supplying drones and missiles to Russia. We have Hamas being supported by Moscow. We have the Chinese working to undermine the sanctions that have been imposed on both Iran and Russia. We've got North Koreans fighting in Ukraine. This was all enabled because of a failure, a strategic failure of the Biden administration to take on any of those adversaries and to hold them to account. It was also a failure to work with allies in Europe and around the world. We were blindsided by the withdrawal from Afghanistan in the United Kingdom. Niall rightly talks about the importance of the special relationship, but it simply didn't exist during that period in office. So we had a failure to take on adversaries, but also a failure to work with allies to show Western strength. This failure to take on adversaries and appease them was accompanied by a failure to take on the internal adversaries. In America, but this phenomenon is reflected across the West in countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, and areas like Europe. I talk about this in my book, 10 Years to Save the West, but we've seen the rise of neo-Marxist philosophies that started off in our universities, but now have infiltrated the public sector. They've infiltrated parts of corporations. They've infiltrated the leftist media. And those ideas are fundamentally anti-Western civilization, anti-American, anti-British, and prefer to back our adversaries than back our own countries. What am I talking about? I'm talking about eco-extremism. I'm talking about anti-capitalism. I'm talking about the support for terrorism like Hamas that we've seen on our campuses and on our streets. I'm talking about gender ideology that acknowledges or fails to acknowledge the basics of human biology. I'm talking about anti-colonialism that claims nothing good ever came of British rule or indeed American leadership. But all of those elements were appeased by the mainstream left to keep the far left on side. And we've seen the same trend in the United Kingdom, the same kowtowing to people who advocate terrorism, who advocate destroying the very values that have made our countries great. Isn't it appalling that after the October the 7th atrocities, that so many mouthpieces in both the UK and the United States refused to acknowledge the truth of what had happened and instead created a propaganda war against Israel that has led to things like the ICC calling for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the sickness that has been allowed to develop within elements of our societies and countries. And the line of responsibility leads directly to the American president who allowed this to happen. The results of this are clear. And today we're talking specifically about Iran. We've seen an emboldened Iran that was able to fund the proxies who carried out the appalling attacks in Israel, that are carrying out attacks around the Middle East, and who've carried out attacks themselves directly. And we've also seen an enriched Iran that has the resources to be able to do that, and doesn't just have the resources to be able to cause instability in the Middle East, that also has the resources to create instability around the world, including supplying weapons to Russia. And we are in a very worrying position now. We are on the verge of something even worse, which is Iran becoming a nuclear power. And the only reason that it hasn't yet been able to do that is because of the brave actions of Israel. Biden has failed to support Israel. He's tried to constrain Israel in what they've been trying to do to take on Iran. The Prime Minister in Britain is even worse. He has put a partial arms embargo on arms the UK is sending to Israel. And he has also backed the ICC in their appalling judgment against Benjamin Netanyahu. So the Trump victory that we saw in November couldn't have come any earlier. We needed that victory, and we can see the change already in terms of what adversaries around the world are saying and doing, and how their approach is changing. So what needs to happen? Well, first of all, it is absolutely vital that Israel has given it our full support in doing everything they need to do to be able to eradicate the Iranian nuclear threat. There should be no holds barred in terms of support for Israel. In fact, I would go further and say the United States needs to be prepared to take action if Israel does not have the capability to do so. That is vital. This is such an existential threat, not just to the Middle East, but to the free world, that the United States has to be prepared to do that. The second thing that needs to happen is the job that Trump started in terms of reducing the capability of the Iranian economy needs to be restarted. We need to cut off their ability to fund terrorism, their ability to fund their ideology, and their ability to fund proxies in other countries. What does that mean? It means maximum pressure sanctions. It means action against their oil and gas installations. And it means the West working much harder to be energy self-sufficient and energy exporters. And I fully support the drill, baby, drill agenda in the United States. I think it's vital, it's absolutely vital that we are able to control the strategic resource of energy, but that needs to happen in Europe too. Europe is sitting on huge amounts of oil and gas, but the eco-extremists have taken it off the table, and that is causing vast problems in terms of our domestic economy, but also vast problems in terms of our strategic ability to take on aggressors like Iran and Russia. I don't think I need to tell the people in this room that one of the biggest difficulties in implementing a real agenda that will undermine Iranian power and undermine Iranian economic power is sitting within our own administrations. It's sitting here in the State Department, in the wider foreign policy establishment. It's certainly sitting in the United Kingdom, in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I had first-hand experience of dealing with bureaucrats who were fundamentally opposed to Israel, fundamentally opposed to taking real action against Iran. They still clung on to the belief that it was possible to negotiate a deal with Iran rather than showing strength versus Iran. And what I noticed as Foreign Secretary is it wasn't just them talking to themselves in London. There was a very deep network with bureaucrats in the United States, in the State Department, bureaucrats in France, bureaucrats in Germany. And in order to pursue a successful agenda to undermine Iranian power, we will need to dismantle the administrative state. I have the scars on my back from taking them on in Britain. I know how difficult it is. I don't underestimate the fight that President Trump is going to have. And I think we're seeing in his appointment of the cabinet a real desire to have that battle. I support the use of Schedule F. I think that's very important. We know that there were many attempts to undermine President Trump's foreign policy agenda in his first term. But that is going to be an almighty battle, and that will need the support of people outside the administration to put pressure on to see those changes. Because without doing that, and without seeking to do that across the West, we will not be able to root out the ideology that has done so much damage in undermining our self-belief, our self-confidence, and our ability to show strength in the face of adversaries. How on earth are China or Iran or Russia going to believe that we are serious if people within our own system don't believe we're serious? And this, to me, is the number one challenge that the Trump administration is going to face, having seen it directly both from bureaucrats in the United Kingdom and bureaucrats here in the United States. The next thing that needs to happen is huge pressure needs to be put on European governments. Europe has become a weak flank on Islamicism. You know, we've seen this with the terrible attacks in Amsterdam. We've seen this on the streets of London with these protests which aren't being properly policed. We've seen this with the campus protests as well. And we've seen it with what is happening in elections across Europe. So back in earlier this year, 4 Islamist separatist MPs were elected to the House of Commons. These are 4 members of parliament who advocate the eradication of Israel. Those people need to be taken on. And the government that allows these movements to gain traction within domestic politics should not be protected from the full force of the free world and putting serious pressure on those people. That is what needs to happen. I want to see the UK prescribe the IRGC. I want to see us not support the ICC's case against Benjamin Netanyahu. I want to see action taken against the proliferation of Sharia law in some of our towns and cities. I want us to see action taken on mass immigration and illegal immigration, which is leading to serious problems in our country. And the UK is not the only country facing these tribulations. So is France, so is Germany, so is the Netherlands. But the United States needs to be actively encouraging a different approach in policy. Otherwise, we are going to find that the extremism we've seen in the Middle East simply is exported to Europe. What I don't think the solution is international bodies like the United Nations or the ICC. They have simply not worked. We know the Security Council hasn't worked. And I would advocate using the G7, using NATO, using the Indo-Pacific Quad as the tools of international policy, ultimately working towards an economic NATO where free nations that believe in our values, Judeo-Christian values, take a common stance towards Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. That is the way that we are going to effect real change. It's through a combination of hard security and economic power. And the stakes couldn't be higher. If the United States and the free world do not succeed in preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, we really are in a very difficult situation. Of course, it will cause regional instability as other countries in the Middle East seek to acquire their own nuclear weapons. It will also pose an even more direct threat to the future existence of Israel. And the axis of authoritarian regimes will be boosted. What it will mean is all four states are nuclear weapons states: China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. If we think the world is difficult now, imagine what that looks like: a nuclear alliance of authoritarian states out to destroy the West. And we know that Iran, having acquired a nuclear weapon, will threaten the use of it. And we also know that of all of those four states, Iran is probably the most likely to use it. That is how important it is that they are prevented from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And if they are prevented from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and if the Iranian economy is debilitated, that will have huge knock-on benefits. It will mean a more stable Middle East. It will also deprive Russia of the missiles and drones they've been using against the Ukrainians. I was hearing that apparently the vast majority of tank drones that are being used are supplied by Iran. And it will also demonstrate to China, to Russia, and to North Korea that the age of appeasement is over and we are returning to an era of peace through strength. Under the Biden administration, we saw appeasement of Iran, and we saw Israel single-handedly holding off the threat of Iranian nuclear capability and the Iranians acquiring a nuclear weapon. What we now have, thanks to President Trump being elected, is the opportunity to put our full force behind Israel, to back them up, and to make sure that the West is strong again, and that we demonstrate peace through strength, and we succeed. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bob Peters. I am the Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. In late April of this year, a senior Iranian lawmaker stated that there's only a, quote, 1 week gap from the issuance of the order to the first test of a nuclear bomb. In July of this year, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken appeared to corroborate the statement when he announced that, quote, instead of being at least a year away from having the breakout capacity of producing fissile material for a nuclear weapon, Iran is now probably 1 or 2 weeks away. Then in August of this year, the IAEA report all but confirmed these statements. They said that as of August, Iran had 363 pounds of uranium enriched up to 60%, which was an increase of 50 pounds since the UN agency's May report. I'll point out, for those of you who don't know, uranium that's enriched up to 60% of purity is just a technical step away from weapons-grade fissile material of 90%. And in fact, in February of 2023, the IAEA reported that IAEA inspectors had found uranium particles enriched up to 83% in Iran's underground facilities. And this finding confirms that Iran is closer than ever to reaching the 90% of purity needed to produce fissile material for a nuclear weapon. Now, in July of this year, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released an unclassified report on Iran's nuclear program. The report did not include a key sentence that had been in several other ODNI reports for the last several years. That sentence that was missing is the following: Iran is not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. To reiterate, that sentence is no longer in the ODNI reports. That same week, Senator Lindsey Graham described the classified version of ODNI's Iran report as, quote, stunning, and said that Iran, quote, could use these 3 or 4 months before our election to sprint to a nuclear weapon. As the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies recently noted, the absence of this sentence, when added to the factors, including Senator Graham's response to the classified report, suggests that the U.S. intelligence community may assess that Iran is currently undertaking key nuclear weaponization activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. So given all these reports and Secretary Blinken's statements, we must assume that a Tehran supply of highly enriched uranium could be converted to enough weapons-grade fissile material to produce a handful of nuclear bombs within a matter of days. And the incoming team has spoken on the prospects of an Iranian bomb. 2 weeks before the election, both Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance and presidential candidate Trump issued a couple statements. Senator Vance said, quote, the U.S. does not want a war in the Middle East, but also cannot afford to accept a nuclear-armed Iran. Candidate Trump said, quote, Iran won't acquire a bomb, but he further elaborated and said that he, quote, doesn't want to see people get killed. And a nuclear-armed Iran would have significant economic consequences within the region, but also globally. There would be immediate security concerns with a latent nuclear-armed Iran, and there's also longer-term proliferation concerns, as Ms. Truss just declared. So what does this all mean? Fortunately, we've got 2 great panelists to help us think through these issues. First, to my left, we have Ben Taleblu. He's Senior Director of FDD's Iran program, where he oversees the breadth and depth of the organization's work on Iran, in addition to serving as a senior fellow specializing in Iranian security and political issues. For well over a decade, Behnam has supported FDD's Iran program in various capacities. Leveraging his subject matter expertise and his native Persian language skills, he closely tracks a wide range of Iran-related functional and regional topics and regularly briefs media, diplomatic, policy, and academic audiences across Washington and the United States. He's also the author of Arsenal, a comprehensive monograph on Iran's ballistic missile program. And I'll point out that he graciously agreed to join us today after our previous speaker, Andrea Stricker, came down with an ear infection and could not hop on a plane. So this is kind of like having Joe DiMaggio fall ill and then have Ted Williams pinch hit. So thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And on the far left, we have Olli Heinonen, who's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. He served as a senior advisor on science and nonproliferation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and as a senior associate at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Belfer Center. His research and teachings include nuclear safety, security, nonproliferation, disarmament, verification of treaty compliance, and the enhancement of verification work through international organizations that focus on the peaceful uses of nuclear technology and energy. He also served for 27 years at the IAEA in Vienna, to include positions as the Deputy Director General and head of its Department of Safeguards. He was also director of at the agency's various operational divisions and was served also as an inspector at overseas offices. So Ollie, thank you. There's fewer technical experts in the world with more experience than Ollie. So at this point, I'd ask both of our panelists to give a few moments of opening remarks, then we'll dive into questions. So Ollie, do you want to begin?
Yes, thank you. First of all, my remarks, they are mine, so I'm not kind of using anyone else's statements. But I have approached this whole Iranian nuclear issue since I left the IAEA 14 years ago from the point of view of risk assessments, because I have seen this development over years and always trying to analyze what is the path Iran is on. Is it really peaceful use of atomic energy, or is it possible preparation for building a nuclear device? And I think that all these nuclear archives and IAEA earlier findings from early 2003 is that actually Iran has a dual course. It produces the capabilities that on a rainy day it can proceed and build in a very short period of time a nuclear capability, which is enough as a deterrence. Small number of nuclear weapons in a secret locations. And can I have that screen which I ask, if it is possible? If not, then I try to take the numbers from my memory, which may stretch your memory and imagination. I'm sorry about it. So let's look where Iran is today in terms of fissile material stocks. They have about 180 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. They have about 800 kilograms 20% enriched uranium, and then about 2.2 tons of, or 2,200 kilograms of enriched uranium between 3 and 5% enriched, which is a typical light water reactor fuel composition in terms of the enrichment. But if you turn clock back a year from now and look at the quantities of stockpiles then, actually they have not produced additional low enriched uranium at all. They have used it as a feed material to produce 20% enriched uranium and 60% enriched uranium. So in reality, Iran has been stocking up only the high enriched uranium and not the low enriched common reactor fuel. Then 60% is interesting because 60% enriched uranium, there's no research reactor which really uses such kind of enrichment. Either they use much higher or they use 20 or less. Right. The only one which I have seen in the public is an icebreaker fuel in Russia. So they have this 55, 56% enriched. I don't think Iran is building icebreakers, so we can put that one aside. So there is no use. But then when you go to this information which we found from the AQ Khan network and which was very well published, actually when you produce highly enriched uranium, 90% weapons grade uranium, you go stepwise. You start with natural uranium. The first cascade units produces you maybe 5% enriched uranium. Next one produces you 20, and third one 60% enriched uranium. And only then you sprint up to the weapons grade. Why? Because there are technical reasons how you are forced to control your enrichment plant. So that's why you need to go on these steps. So it's surprising that Iran has picked those exact enrichment steps. And then I think that the organizers can put my paper on the website so you can read it afterwards. I made a model. I said that the last print is fast, and you don't need very many centrifuges. In this scheme of AQ Khan, you had only about 150 centrifuges in the last step, not thousands. So if we take those IR6s, the best Iranian centrifuges, which they now have, 4 cascades of those, each of about 160 machines. That facility with those 4 cascades requires a space of maybe 3 or 4 times of this auditorium, and you have everything inside. Feed, withdrawal, conditioning of centrifuges, control rooms, all what you need, and you can produce in such a small installation enough fissile material from this 80 kilogram stock. First weapon you have enough maybe in 1 week time. For second weapon another week, third, fourth, and you go, and you have there at least for 4 or 5 nuclear weapons worth of 60% enriched uranium now. But then you have to do a little bit more, and you have to convert it to uranium metal, which many people forget. That takes about 1 month. If you follow that same scheme which Mr. Khan gave to his clients. So in reality, after a little bit more than 1 month, you have actual components of the nuclear weapon available. As Mr. Salehi said 2-3 months ago, that Iran has all the capabilities and pieces in place, at least the know-how. And then you can do it very differently compared to the normal practice. Follow a little bit like the India-Pakistani route. Prepare everything in advance. So the only thing which is missing from you is putting the nuclear device together. You have electronics, you have high explosives, you have a missile to deliver. Those are already waiting there, and the only thing is missing are those uranium metal buttons, and you assemble it. And this is what the United States of America did in 1940s with the Hiroshima bomb. So I think that with this nice final sentence, I leave this. And then I just want to bring your attention also a couple of small things, which are actually big things. First of all, you have seen that Iran starts to have this debate about the nuclear doctrine, and even Foreign Minister Araghchi was the other day cautioning people that please remember that there are people who are visiting that. But at the same time, I mentioned this nuclear installation where they could test to nuclear weapon, which will not be known to the IAEA. It will be secret, like Fordo enrichment plant. Its size will be only 1/4 of Fordo. Good to remember that also. But do we know it? How we know it? We didn't know Fordo when it started 2003, 2004. First signs emerged somewhere 2006 or 2007 that they were doing something, but people didn't know exactly where. So if you want to eliminate that part of the program, the secret part, you need to know where it is. You cannot bomb unknown. So therefore, it is important that the coalition, as Prime Minister Truss just said, gets together, analyzes together this information to make sure that Iran cannot proceed on the path of the nuclear weaponization further. So these are the polarizing messages I have.
This is why I always like having Ollie around, because even a dumb political science major like me can understand that no country on earth puts together multiple cascades of centrifuges to enrich uranium for a civilian nuclear power reactor. Even that is understandable, and then try to understand what are the implications of that. Benham, do you have some opening thoughts that you could share?
Sure, I'll try to keep them brief and just make them as footnotes to some of the tail end comments both Prime Minister Truss mentioned about this growing axis of authoritarians. At FDD, we call them an axis of aggressors, as well as a footnote to some of the finer technical points that Oli has just been mentioning as well about this change in the rhetoric around Iran's nuclear doctrine. But I want to begin with a quick take on 2024, because this has been a history-making year. I just got back from a trip just across the pond to some say the UK and EU countries, actually trying to handhold and arm twist as politely as I can as a non-government person on trying to make sure that in this transatlantic space, we see the threat the same way, exactly as Ali said. I have this campaign, in the 2020s, the Five Eyes countries plus the EU need to see the threats coming from Iran with 2020 vision. That means moral and political clarity and apply the resources we need to counter them. And in this space, what I hear very much is that, Behnam, all of this pressure that you or potentially a Trump administration may want can jeopardize the main goal that has united us for so long, which is trying to keep the Islamic Republic of Iran away from a nuclear weapon. And all the things you worry about, drones, missiles, transatlantic ties, cyber, sanctions busting, will get worse, not better, if the Islamic Republic develops a nuclear weapon. Therefore, primus inter pares is the counterproliferation challenge. However, faced with this, we have to realize that the Islamic Republic has been doing things that no nuclear weapon state has done. And that takes us to 2024. Not once, not twice, but thrice. In 2024, the Islamic Republic of Iran did something that neither the US nor the Soviet Union nor India-Pakistan did, which is a non-nuclear weapon state attacked overtly, conventionally, and directly the territory of a nuclear weapon state. Once against Pakistan in January, once against Israel in April, and once again against Israel on October. This is 3 times too many, right? Take your IR textbook about nuclear weapons and deterring and throw it out the window, because clearly that was not sufficient to deter the Islamic Republic here. And they did so in all 3 instances with an arsenal of ballistic missiles, which for over a decade and a half, or almost 2 decades now, the Director of National Intelligence has been saying is not only the most likely delivery vehicle for a nuclear weapon, as Ali just mentioned, that warhead could be mated with a ballistic missile, but is also the largest and most diverse in the region. So they're flexing these muscles. There's a lower threshold for the use of these weapons than ever before, and they're clearly undeterred. And then when you layer this onto the history of other, and Ali knows this excellently, WMD-related endeavors of the Islamic Republic, worryingly, for example, not just that they may be in violation of their safeguards or their NPT commitments, but you look at some other things as well, such as in the chemical weapons space. This is a regime that has actually transferred chemical weapons in the middle part of the Iran-Iraq war to its then partner Libya, who was fighting, Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya, was fighting Chad at that time in the 1980s. And then also, despite Iran being on the tail end receiving lots of chemical weapons attacks against Saddam Hussein, by Saddam Hussein in the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq war, it also changed its doctrine. And the CIA reporting now, which is declassified, says that moral and religious and political prohibitions that once prevented Iran from using CW melted away when the strategic environment changed. And Iran, in April 1987, had its first use of chemical weapons on the battlefield against Iraq. So you look at the WMD use, you look at the WMD proliferation, you look at this entire nuclear architecture that Ali has mentioned, and then you take into account this changing conventional military and geostrategic environment, and the Islamic Republic is quite keen to capitalize on all of these nuclear threats that not it is just making, but that it's watching or working to great effect that its great power partner Putin is making vis-a-vis his nuclear capabilities against Ukraine. So we are living in a world where it used to be once every 4 or 5 years you would have an official from the Islamic Republic hint at the potential nuclear direction they may go to. Between the month of October and November today, there have been at least 13 official and unofficial statements about them being willing to change their nuclear doctrine, or hardline newspapers controlled by or tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps pushing for this. Some of them are outright even saying if we had a nuclear weapon, things like the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas chief who had visited Tehran in late July, early August, would not have happened. So there are changes being brought to you in the non-proliferation space by this geostrategic environment. And that which we thought in the deterrence world was enough to hold them back, or that which we thought about past Iranian behavior would be a good enough model to deter them, needs to be thrown out the window, and urgently.
Terrific. So we'll have a few questions, then we'll open it up to the audience for a broader Q&A. Behnam, first question for you. So there have been instances in which states have had stockpiles of plutonium, and some have said, well, that state's a latent nuclear power or virtual nuclear power, and that they haven't made the decision to become a nuclear weapons state as yet, but they want to keep the door open to go down that route if they see the security environment changing for the worse. In your view, has Iran made the decision one way or the other, or are they looking to hedge and have this kind of virtual nuclear capability so that they can take the fissile material and assemble it with the warheads and the ballistic missiles?
You know, this is as much driven by open source as studying Iranian behavior, and we can only just still venture a guess. But in my view, post-2002-2003, the revelation of those sites, prior to 2002-2003, with the revelation of those nuclear sites, the regime's goal was to present a nuclear fait accompli, that small arsenal that Ali was talking about. Since 2002-2003, it's layered on this civilian veneer, tried to engage in some kind of limited nuclear diplomacy with the West, with the P5+1, and it's slowed its nuclear progress, but in other areas it's been able to step it up to keep it for that rainy day option. But to go back to that first question, as you see with the Middle East changing, as you see with the Iranian leadership changing, as you see with the geostrategic environment changing, it's not just raining, it's pouring. So that is what is begetting this increased risk tolerance, the comments about the changes in their nuclear doctrine, and even stories that we saw, for example, not just with the DNI reporting, but from Axios this summer, from June and July, where both from an intelligence perspective, the United States as well as Israel had detected things that were not akin from a top-down go order for a nuclear weapon, but from a bottom-up kind of scientific defense industrial base, research center, bureaucratic hedging and latency effort. You know, I was actually, prior to the string of Israeli military successes in the region, working on a paper idea with a scholar who formerly used to be part of the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency Commission, just in an individual capacity though. And we were talking about this unique model that Iran has, which is staying in the NPT, using proxies, using missiles, but having a technical latency strategy and a political hedging strategy. And acting like, in the past 2 decades in the Middle East, a country that has a nuclear deterrent without actually having had to pay the political cost to cross that threshold. And now, at least, it's sinking more political costs to make it look like more credibly to us that it will. And that is their nuclear sword of Damocles against us. So we can't come down yes or no, but we do have to assess this change in risk and note all of the investments that Ali had mentioned in this infrastructure for a time of their own choosing.
So Ali, I mean, similar questions, I guess, from a more technical perspective. Do you see Iran taking the steps that one would expect if they had made the decision to go and acquire nuclear weapons capability?
Well, we don't know what is in their mind, but spending time, you know, myself, maybe more than 20 years with the Iranians, they never burn all the bridges. So I'm sure it is in their mind if the things get sour, and it might be more to do with the regime and its security that they decide to go. But they can still increase the threat, for example, going up to 90% enriched uranium by arguing that this is a high or more advanced research reactor which needs such kind of fuel. We have such kind of reactors even in Europe. So that will be one way to boost it. And I saw the other day, Abbasi Davani actually said it, I think, a few days ago, and there was someone else. So they keep still this options of tightening screws up. But then I also want to remind one thing. I have spent a lot of time with Pakistanis. And Pakistan, when it made the nuclear tests in 1998, It did first day 5 tests and next day 1. 6 tests on 2 days. Why they were able to do it and successfully? Because they had more than 20 cold tests where they tested detonations, making sure that the fission or the compression happens in such a way that you get a nuclear detonation. You use the surrogate materials to do it. They did in 20 different locations in order to conceal it from the intelligence. So I would caution people that if Iran goes for nuclear or some other country, we should not expect a nuclear test necessarily. It will be more a political message that we got the capability. And a good recent case on that was North Korea. Left the NPT 2003, 3 years later, first nuclear test. Do you think that they did everything during this 3 years' time? No, they were preparing that for decades before.
So we have histories of states trying to preemptively destroy clandestine nuclear programs going back to the 1980s. Prime Minister Truss mentioned the possibility of Israel conducting a strike, potentially an Israeli-U.S. strike that's joint. But there are a lot of challenges there. I mean, given where some of these sites are and how deeply buried some of these potential targets are, do we even have the capability to do that? And Ben, I'm going to turn to you for that first.
Both in terms of the capability, surely in terms of the military capability alone. You may remember from about a decade ago in this town, the talk of the MOP or that could be dropped from the B-2, for example. The U.S. has the capability to hit hardened, buried targets. Probably within the less than 60-meter world is ideal, but it certainly has the capability. It's really thinking of a military campaign rather than an operation that begins to get you into the political and strategic challenges of, okay, first suppression or destruction of enemy air defense, defending assets in the region from Iranian precision fire, these kind of things that waters down the will to use such a capability, plus, of course, the diverse, hardened, and spread out nature of these targets vis-a-vis some of the other historical examples where the Israelis solo were able to hit really one site above ground that was not really dispersed or hardened. There's also, of course, the new context, which is, the Iranians, the emperor has no clothes right now. In terms of long-range air and missile defense, the S-300 is reportedly disabled or gone. We assume that also for the Iranian version of the S-300, the Bavar 373, but that doesn't mean that when you need to move much more closer over Iranian territory rather than fire from a distance, you may not run up against a rather well-layered and foreign procured and domestically produced short and mid-tier air and missile defense architecture that will at least increase the risk. It would not handicap or prevent such an operation, but it'll increase the risk. And this is how the Islamic Republic has always lived to fight another day. It's not about winning. It's about increasing the cost to us of being able to win. And you don't have to take it from me. In a documentary where they had lots of commentary by the commander of the aerospace force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, this is a guy with his finger literally on the biggest ballistic missile arsenal in the region. He compares Iranian military capability to American, and he says he knows he's outgunned, but that which the Iranians have the balance of is not the balance of capability, it's the balance of resolve. So in many ways, Western political irresolution has been a handicapping factor more than Iranian military deterrence.
So, I mean, that's a great point, particularly on the campaign. I mean, the air campaign to roll back Iranian missile defenses, in and of itself, air and missile defenses in itself would be significant even before you start putting ordnance on target. And even once you do, there would be the prospects of Iran reconstituting what they've lost, and then you go back to this mowing the lawn type challenge that we may find ourselves in.
And per what Ali said, it's all about the intelligence. You have to know these sites. What happens if you have already, as you have now, correct me if I'm wrong, Ali, about centrifuge manufacturing. We may not have continuity of knowledge.
No, you don't. But I would, the biggest risk at this point of time for me is this stocks of high-enriched uranium in Iran, because they can very swiftly move it to an unknown location. And the IAEA is not sitting on top of those cylinders 24, 360 days a year. They have frequent inspections, and Iran can all of a sudden say, now we have a security concern and you cannot come this week. And then they move this material to the other place. And this is actually what Saddam Hussein was planning to do before the Gulf War, to move some of the materials to unknown location and then not let the IAEA in.
So let's posit a world in which Iran becomes a nuclear power. What are the prospects that are longer term for both the region but also globally? And Ali, I mean, from your perspective, what may be the proliferation implications of Iran becoming a nuclear power, both within the region but then external to the region?
Well, this is more a political question. But
it is.
You know, I think that it will be a threat to Saudis in particular, because there are also some other aspects, religion and, you know, how they handle the region. And some other countries may also look, you know, nuclear capabilities. At least they want to have a deterrence and maybe an umbrella to support them. Emirates, Kuwait, Turkey. So there are a lot of these other countries which will look for capability. And then they cannot get it overnight. But let's remember the statements of Saudi security advisor who was now retired. He always said when we were in Harvard, what Iran gets, we will get.
Benham, can you kind of walk us through, in your sense, what might be some of the security and then economic impacts of a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic?
Well, I for one think it would be significant. There is obviously this minority and rather academic school of thought that, you know, because this regime is a security seeker, it would be placated and then no harm, no foul. There's a balance of terror in the region. But as you see in the region, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism has no problem continuing to be the arsonist of the multiple fires that we already see in the region. So I, for one, treat this as a question of volume. Every single functional or regional threat that we face from the Islamic Republic will, for lack of a better word, and to borrow from Spinal Tap, be turned up to 11. Whether that is the risk of proliferation to other actors, whether in terms of the partners of the Islamic Republic. Remember, Iran occupies a very unique position, as Prime Minister Truss was saying, in this axis of aggressors, because it's the connective tissue between the other kind of horizontal mid-tier threats, Syria, Venezuela, above them, the great powers, Russia, China, perhaps North Korea, and below them, the constellation of non-state actors that the regime has created or co-opted. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Iran-backed Shia militias, what have you. So it sits at this critical juncture between the axis of resistance and the axis of aggressors. So there's the proliferation fears there. There is the militias, sui generis, and Iran's terrorist apparatus, which is global, being more emboldened, thinking that they do have precisely what they had wanted, which is this nuclear umbrella. There is, of course, you know, Iranian risk-taking in domains that we would not have been able to project, like, you know, Iranian ballistic missiles for the first time ever being transferred onto the European continent. You know, these are game-changing developments. And of course, unfortunately, that which engages in the foreign aggression is also that same hand which engages in domestic suppression. You know, you couldn't have a better example in Iran of a fundamental chasm between state and society, and I say this proudly as an Iranian American, and this may be America and the West's best long-term hope for counterproliferation, which is a change from below. And the Iranian people have been bravely protesting against their regime in different iterations from 2017 to present. Since 2009, despite this business you hear from the regime in Iran saying death to Israel, since 2009, you've had Iranians chanting, saying, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran. So you have fundamentally an aging Islamist authoritarian regime and fundamentally a younger, more dynamic democracy, or at least representative government seeking nationalist population. And these two things don't fundamentally mesh. And their next steps against their own government on the street or with strikes would be met with greater force because the regime would feel, well, we just bested the United States of America in the P5+1. Who are our unarmed compatriots who we have regularly beaten back so easily?
So final question before we open it up for the audience Q&A. Given that we heard from both then candidate Trump and Senator Vance that another war in the Middle East is not in American interest. We don't want to see more bloodshed, but at the same time, Iran becoming a nuclear power is unacceptable. What are the prospects for whether a JCPOA 2.0 or another non-JCPOA like model that may have greater prospects for success? What are the prospects for some type of diplomatic outcome that could prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, bring some semblance of stability to the region, but then also ideally try to avoid that type of conflict? And that's to both of you.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, but we have to learn from the lesson. As long as Iran has the enrichment capability, it will use it also for other purposes than to produce electricity to light bulbs, I would say, because this is an insurance policy. So, and this was the flaw of the JCPOA-1, that actually today, if we had proceeded the way JCPOA was designed, Iran would now be ramping up enrichment anyway. And Obama even at one point of time acknowledged that. So I think that it has to be very different in nature. It should not be also an arms control type of agreement. It should be really a disarmament agreement where adequate verification is done like it was done in South Africa or somewhere else, or Taiwan or South Korea, the small ones, to make sure that one knows what was there, and then you have a long-term monitoring in place. If Iran can agree to that, that's fine. If it doesn't agree, in my view, it has another agenda which is not in our interest.
So for those who may not be steeped as much in nuclear proliferation history, the examples that Ali mentioned of South Africa, Taiwan, and South Korea, those are states that either acquired or pursued nuclear capabilities, and then as part of a non-arms control agreement, actually removed or dismantled or destroyed the ability to produce fissile material. So,
yeah, can I? You know, like in South Africa, we followed, or IAEA followed it. Still, 20 years after dismantlement, had a right to do what we call transparency visits with a reason. You had to justify why you go. And I remember I was poking some places to make sure to see that they have not started or introduced new activities to those places where they had skills and capabilities. So something like that should have been done. And I know that the Trump administration tried to do it in North Korea, but the North Koreans didn't agree.
On the idea of a JCPOA type agreement, I do think that is unlikely, not just for the political constraints that may exist, but also the technical facts on the ground. You know, 2024, 2025 is certainly not 2012 to 2015 when the US and the P5+1 were negotiating. There's a lot of genies you can't put back in the box. There's a lot of things non-proliferation experts have been mentioning in the first 2 years of the Biden administration that were knowledge-based gains that cannot be rolled back. So I would even question at this point in time the fundamental utility of this non-proliferation agreement and would really push for what Ali just mentioned, which is a disarmament agreement. However, knowing the politics and the context of the situation, which is stuff in the Middle East, the rule is things are getting worse, not better, I find that harder to achieve. And the concern that I've actually seen on different shades of the American political spectrum about, you know, President Trump doing what he did in North Korea, but kind of copy-paste with the Iranians, I actually find that to be rather dubious, despite the fact that, you know, then candidate Trump in 2015, plus the first year and a half of his administration, he talked about wanting to fix the deal. His line before he even entered office in the first term was, I buy bad deals, I make them good deals. I do think the Iranians this go around are going to try to play up his transactional nature, but they will run into real brick walls, which is an ideological brick wall from the supreme leader, as well as, of course, unpacking that, because Trump is the president that killed Qasem Soleimani, Iran's chief terrorist. Trump is the president that did the maximum pressure sanctions, which proved that the US could unilaterally, in a year and a half's time, replicate the macroeconomic damage of more than a decade plus of multilateral sanctions. And he's the president who in this town broke the conventional wisdom taboo that when the Iranian people are protesting out in the street, as they did 2017, 2018, 2019, under his term, that first of all, you could have maximum pressure and the population would not blame the foreign country. And second, that you could at least rhetorically support the Iranian people and this would not be the kiss of death, which is a sharp contrast with President Obama in 2009 with the Green Movement. So for these three reasons, I see the Iranians trying to take advantage of his transactional nature, but really having limited runway for this trying to take advantage. Plus, of course, there probably will be somebody in the administration, man or woman, bureaucrat or political appointee, who will probably, in my view, copy-paste that which allegedly, is written in the historical fiction of what happened in the Greco-Persian Wars, which is 2,500 years ago in the court of Xerxes in, at that point, ancient Persia. There was somebody who grabbed the emperor's hand every night before dinner, kind of paid by his father, Emperor Darius, for Emperor Xerxes to kind of remember the Greek thread. He would say, "Sire, remember the Athenians." And there might be someone here who would say, "Sir, they tried to kill you, don't forget that." And that will have a limiting effect on the transactional nature as well.
Great. We've got time for some questions, so please raise your hands if you've got a question for one of the panelists. In the back, please.
Hi. Do the recent losses by the IRGC's axis of resistance that we're seeing in Syria help accelerate their run towards nuclear breakout?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that IRGC people were part of the Ahmad plan. So it's in their agenda that the nuclear is something which is worth of thinking. And then when we look back in time and when the Ahmad plan was stopped, actually many of these guys went to the laboratories and universities which are belonging to the Revolutionary Guards, or some of them also to the armed forces. So I think the spirit is there and they see it as a useful tool. And some of them are advocating also today in public that they should actually revisit the doctrine. On top of that, they have skillful scientists. We should not forget, this all comes from the people. So they were top scientists which were working in these projects in the past, and then they went to these universities, and we don't know what they have been doing, frankly speaking, last 10 years. We know that they got together with Mr. Fakhrizadeh every now and then. I don't think they went to talk about weather. The only thing which was common to them was the program. So was this just to maintain the partnership and friendships, or was it more? I think that this is one of those things which the IAEA has to get access to. There are a lot of places which IAEA has not visited, which are either in the Ahmad Plan documents or are places which were created after 2003.
Yeah, I just strongly second that. We need to create this linkage with the nuclear and the non-nuclear threats this regime poses, because it's the same engine that in many ways is underwriting them. And I wouldn't just say Syria, I would say really the damage done, the Israeli military successes against different elements of this axis of resistance, including the crown jewel of its terror proxies, which is Lebanese Hezbollah, which for so long had been likened to this North Korea-South Korea situation, where the conventional capabilities of North Korea could also deter and threaten South Korea, and the conventional and the precision strike capabilities and the drones of Lebanese Hezbollah could function as some kind of Iranian extended deterrent in defense of its nuclear program. So, you're hearing this from all sorts of analysts, government, former government, American, European, left, right, center, doesn't matter, that in the decline of its conventional deterrent architecture, the nuclear one is growing.
I think we've got time for one more question before we break. Sure.
Jim Hawkins, I appreciate the panel's insights. Thank you very much. We tangentially touched on this, but I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, if I may, do you see any benefit, would you see any benefit in the West more overtly advocating for a regime change?
I was actually going to ask a question which is relevant to your question, which is what do you think would follow if the regime were deposed? And I personally don't think the West should advocate a regime change. I believe that regime change needs to come from within. It needs to come from the people of Iran. I think we've got a history of failed regime changes. I think that the objective should be circumcised to making sure Iran does not have the capability to get a nuclear weapon and does not have the capability to cause the type of regional instability and the threat to Israel that we've seen. It should be essentially a containment strategy. That is my view. Now, do I think it's an illegitimate regime? Yes, I do. But the pressure for changing regimes has to come from within.
I mean, I would just slightly footnote that with saying the Iranian people have been showing in broad swaths how they've tried. So this is not something I think we should respectfully compare to Iraq or Afghanistan. This is the real question is, as the West pursues some kind of vigorous containment, deterrence, rollback strategy on the security threats, how does prudence dictate that they develop a plan B so they're not caught off guard by what happens, and also so they don't lose fundamentally, besides Israel, the most pro-American population in the Middle East? I mean, this is a country where in the post-October 7 Middle East, the only place you'll find a Palestinian flag is actually in a government office. It's where you have a drastically different view of the foreign and security policy threats from the state on one side and the society on the other side. So I think prudence dictates that we try to find complementary policies that can be married with maximum pressure. At FED, we've pioneered that, calling it maximum support, where in terms of the cyber world, where in terms of the messaging world, where in terms of the sanctions world, can the US and the West really help level the playing field? And with the UK and our transatlantic partners, the prescription of the IRGC, as you mentioned, would go super long in being a wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters who are organically doing this. And the Iranian diaspora in each of these countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, has been calling for it for many years. So, a marriage of strategy and values, I think, would be the right approach here, not one sacrificed on the altar of the other.
Well, we're about out of time. This has been a terrific discussion, and I can't imagine a more challenging topic for the new team that's coming in than this very issue. So I certainly don't envy them in that regard. Before we break, though, please join me in thanking our panelists as well as Prime Minister Truss for joining us here today. You all as well for coming, and thanks to all our viewers online. For those of you who can't quite get enough, this will be posted on our YouTube channel as well later this week. And thanks again, and safe travels. Thank you.